the most masculine of the parents, is the one who introduces us to reality in a certain way, and by mimicking the parent and listening to their instruction and understanding that there's certain things we can do and certain things we can't do, we understand that there's a permissiveness that's allowed by the parents, and also there's a prohibitive quality of the parent. Well, all this taken together creates what is called our conscience, what Freud related to as the superego. Basically, our consciousness comes about. And we slowly move away from the pleasure principle in a hard way, meaning that we still want pleasure, we'll always want pleasure, but now we find that we just can't go out and rape and murder and do whatever we want to be gratified. We're going to have to find certain sublimated ways in which to attain what it is that our id, our unconscious, really wants. And of course, this transition is rather traumatic, and sometimes we can't make it. And Freud and Jung referred to that process as regression, when the strictures of reality and the impositions that reality, imposes upon us all through childhood can sometimes become too much. And so we can't handle it. We have to have what we want. So what we do is we regress psychically to a previous state within our own consciousness, a more animistic, a more basic, more primitive state. This is what happens with a lot of human beings. And in a radical way, if it happens, we can even become murderers and serial killers, and all sorts of criminal activities can start becoming the means by which we try to break through reality in other ways to get what we want. And of course, the less and less that society provides normal, healthy ways for us to get what we want, for us to expatiate our conscious, unconscious content, the more likely it is that we'll become perverse in these matters. Now, creativity and all that brings civilization comes into being by the restraints of the reality principle, which develops from the need to postpone immediate gratification. The ego censors and, if necessary, represses the forces of the id. That was just Freud's term for the unconscious mind. The general perversity of most mainstream programs in the media, which captivate the attention and imagination of millions, serves to encourage collective regression to the state of the pleasure principle, which is uncreative, uncivilized, and amoral. So I know that's a little heady, but it's very important to realize that there's a very important strategy. These people are well informed. Madison Avenue ad corporations have sometimes 50 or more paid psychologists on their staff who for every single ad will sit there in a lecture theater, and they have 50 on staff on call and many, many other ones associated with them to sit down and minute by minute, second by second, analyze an advertisement, its colors, its movement, its content, the phraseology, the memes, all of it in total, to say, no, change this, do it this way. Paid psychologists, fully cognizant about how the human behavior works, in order to sell us 2 seconds of an advertisement. And on the question of repression, Dr. D.W. Winnicott says, if society is in danger, it is not because of man's aggressiveness, but because of the repression of personal aggressiveness in individuals. And J.A.C. Brown says, during 1 week in 1954, New York television, someone was injured or threatened with violence once in every 6 minutes of program time. In the tarot cards, those who are interested in the metaphysical connotation of this, Freud's pleasure principle and the reality principle are mentioned in cards 7 and 8, with card 7 being the more austere, prohibitive type of life in which we conform and suppress our needs, our basic needs, and card 8 being the fulfillment, the healthy and fulfillment of that, and the recognition that we have certain drives and the culture-building ways in which we can go about fulfilling those drives in a non-criminalistic way, which is the art of life. But those who are behind the advertising edifice, they're not interested in the art of life. They're interested in reducing us to the primitive level. I want, I want, I want, and we'll give you whatever you want. The basic animistic limbic personality. Capitalism served fresh daily, making associations for us that we would not normally associate. Seducing us by appealing to the lower instincts, the lower drives, and to the limbic realm, to confuse and deprive us of a natural and healthy sexuality, perhaps, which the great Dr. Wilhelm Reich, who came after Freud and who knew Freud, spent his whole life trying to show us how we are distanced and disconnected from our own body and are unable to actually feel biotic pleasure. We're forced by Christianity, especially women, from childhood are brought up that way, to act and dress and behave in a certain way that really represses the natural instincts. And the cultural icons that are put in front of us that we model ourselves on are all incredibly unhealthy. But then, of course, if you're doing that, we're going to find unhealthy ways to fulfill it. So we have a pornographic culture which takes care of it. But always, even in the most elementary and basic of advertisements, we're always promised something. It's very important that they get our complicity because they're promising us something. We're empty and we want somebody else to rule our lives for us. We've turned off our own thinking. So if somebody says, hey, you know, you'll be smarter, you'll be happier, you'll be sexier, that's it, that's all we need. And we're right in there. But of course, we're never told about the nightmare list that comes with that. You reach out your hand and play with the devil, and what are the results? To be disassociated, to be addicted, to be bipolar and manic depressive, suicidal no less, delinquent, utterly sociopathic and institutionalized, what the ancient people used to call possessed. If they came into our world today and saw the state we're in, they'd have no difficulty understanding that we're under the hex, that we're not in our own mind. Take just one area of the problem, obesity. Media incessantly report statistics about obesity and diet, but we almost never report about the reasons for this or other social crises which derive from alienation, addiction, and other psychological causes. That's right. From morning to night, magazines and news programs and news inserts and stories about obesity and the horrors of it, and it'll just present the problem and cut it right there. You will be lucky to get half a sentence on the causes, let alone a whole show or an entire analysis, which could do so much for the human race. Could do much to tell us, oh, so this is what causes it. Wow, I've got a handle on, you know, this now. I can take real measures. The very word consumption, to be a consumer, comes from the word consumption, which originally meant to pillage and desecrate and destroy, and also to have tuberculosis. In ancient days, if you had tuberculosis, they said that you had consumption, meaning you couldn't breathe, you were literally being strangled. Today we call it affluenza. The population of one city in the US consumes more than a country of 100 million people. 1/4 of the human race consumes 3/4 of the world's resources. Since the 50s, Americans have consumed more resources than anyone on the planet previously. Each person uses over 20 tons of raw materials annually. There are 1 billion credit cards in circulation, but fewer than 1/3 are paid off in time. In 1996, more Americans declared bankruptcy than they graduated from college. Americans spend more on driving each year than we do on health, education, or food. Although we're only 5% of the world's population, we generate 50% of the world's vehicle mileage and use 40% of the oil produced in the world. As I've said before in other programs in this series, this type of predicament, this kind of barrage and toxicity is mounting every time, every year, and it's not going to go away. We have the death of the middle class on our hands. We've got corporate powers and government apparatus that realizes that the corporations have all their power now. And there's no need to even keep the illusion of the white market. There's no reason even to have a middle class that pushes the wheel, because that had a purpose. If you follow some of the other shows that we've done, you'll see that the creation of the middle class and the conquering of America and the whole industrial revolution had a purpose. It had a set agenda. But see, now we're in the days where that agenda has been met. The corporations have all the power they need. They don't require a facade anymore. They don't need to sweet talk us anymore. So what we're dealing with here now is the death of the middle class. The ladder is being pulled up and it's sink or swim. What we're talking about here is nothing less than the abolition of man. Carl Jung says that consciousness is a very recent acquisition of nature, and it is still in an experimental state. It is frail, menaced by specific dangers, and easily injured. As anthropologists have noted, one of the most common mental derangements that occur among primitive people is what they call the loss of a soul. Now, do you think those primitive people who are suffering like that have anything like the barrage against them that we now suffer? the assault upon our consciousness, on our libido, from childhood. The first symptoms that are out of control we start seeing at puberty, where we feel completely disorientated and out of sorts. We're talking about, we have people mentioning the generation gap. That alone is a problem, but nobody ever tells you who is Generation X, what really is the generation gap and how is it caused. And they have a tremendous knowledge. As we said in the foreword of this program, there's individuals who are highly skilled, the Michelangelos and Leonardos of our age, and they study the whole nature of the connection between the mind and the world. There's a very deep study, and linguists and anthropologists know what we're talking about. In a short program like this, we haven't the time or space to do a full work on this. We can merely give an overview of some of the major problems and leave it to your own motivation and intelligence to carry on. But as Baudrillard the philosopher said, there's a thing in itself and there's a symbol of that thing, and it can be confusing when we lose track of which is real. Because remember, there's a mind that is perceiving. We understand from psychology that there's many levels to what we call the self. We have the outward persona behind which we hide. The persona is very important. It's the part of us that helps us interact with other people in the world and to just get what we want. Without a persona, we wouldn't be able to fit in. And persona is, in Greek, meant mask. But unfortunately, behind the persona also lies the real self. Because we're meeting somebody's representative when we meet them, we're not meeting the real self. Unfortunately, the downside of that is that we don't know who's behind that mask. And unless you have a very high intuition or highly developed psychological skills, you could be duped and fooled. The persona is a very important aspect of consciousness, but there's a downside, because the person can hide their true face. Then we have the ego and all of its complexes, and many deeper levels of the self. Now, the admen that I'm talking about, and that Kilborn is referring to, understand the dynamic interactions between the conscious and the unconscious mind. And perhaps they know even how to access these deeper strata of consciousness. We have to understand also that there's many levels of intelligence. Very slowly now, scholars are discovering that we don't just have mental intelligence. The body itself has its own form of intelligence, a cellular intelligence that keeps us alive. After all, you don't tell your own eyes to blink or your heart to beat, but it does it anyway, doesn't it? The operation of the body is a high form of intelligence. Then there's also emotional intelligence, what we call the intelligence of the heart. We always talk about the brain and the heart, but is there a brain in the heart? And a heart in the brain? Now, for generations of time, our forefathers always knew that words, symbols, colors, rhythms, light, movement, and mudras, and so on, talismans, have always been used for the spiritual uplift of mankind. One of the things that motivates me very strongly in this particular thesis, I may be talking at great length about the subversion aspects, but you see, coming from the spiritual background, a spiritual community, I'm very aware that these things were once in the keeping of the high magi, those who were dedicated to the uplift of civilization. Now we find the same tools in a different basket. You see, it's our job to take them back. Somebody has appropriated these techniques from the children of the light, and it's our duty to take them back. They were ours first of all. We allowed them to get robbed from us, and now we have to take them back. It's also important to realize, as an extension of what Freud and Jung and Reich have been saying, that we have a body, yes, and the body religiously is said to be disconnected or different from what we call the soul on a spiritual level. We have to understand, though, that there's a thing called the brain, and it's not the same as the mind. This might come as a shock to some people who think that brain and mind mean the same thing. No, it doesn't. The brain is that part of us which is the machine, the biological machine that helps us to work in the world, that paves our way, that gives us the intelligence to operate as human beings in the world. But the mind is something different, more rarefied. Basically, it is the soul. And you can program the brain, but you cannot program the mind. The mind is has a different quality and a great deal more depth. Brain is mechanical. Mind is spiritual. The human brain is divided into 3 basic categories based on the levels of phylogenetic development of the species. However, the mind is hierarchical.